Welcome to the 33rd Annual Mayor's Environment Expo. As we come together from around the city, I would like to acknowledge that the Calgary area, where the Bow and Elbow Rivers meet, is a place of confluence, where the sharing of ideas and opportunities naturally come together. Indigenous people were the original caretakers of this land and the first champions of environmental conservation. This land is a home that we all share, and it's vitally important that we protect our home, our environment, by working together. What drives my optimism is seeing the innovation and commitment to climate action from all of you, our students. I will continue to amplify youth voices on the climate crisis, and I look forward to hearing your ideas. I hope this session sparks conversations and encourages all of us to take greater action in protecting our environment. Thank you all for participating.
So I just want to say welcome everybody and thank you so much for joining us today for this presentation. My name is Adine and I'm joined by my colleague Catherine, who's going to be your moderator behind the scenes. And we're from an organization called Inside Education. So Inside Education is a nonprofit. That means we're a charity and we do natural resource and environmental education for students and teachers all across Alberta. And I want to take a moment to acknowledge the land that we all share. Today we are in Treaty 7 territory, the traditional lands of the Blackfoot Confederacy, including the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina Nation, the Stoney Nakoda First Nation, and part of Métis Region Number 3. These First Peoples of our area have in general looked at the land from a lens of great respect and think about using things from nature as borrowing from future generations. I think this is a great way to look at our natural resources and how we use them, and I like to keep this in the back of my mind when I think about ways I can try and conserve our resources in my own life, which will be a theme throughout our presentation today. So something I do want you to think about as we go through today's presentation is, why are natural resources important? And why do you care about natural resources? Today, we are going to be taking a virtual tour of Alberta's natural regions. And as mentioned before, we are going to be drawing and filling in a map of Alberta. So you can either do this individually on a blank piece of paper or as a class on the whiteboard. Also, if you have any questions, please put them into the Q&A and Catherine will try and answer them behind the scenes. So we are going to be taking a natural regions road trip today, exploring the past, present, and future of Alberta. We're going to be starting millions of years ago and ending up today at present time. So to start, I want you to draw this outline of Alberta. It doesn't have to be perfect, just a simple sketch, and I'll give you about 30 seconds to do so. And as we go through our presentation today, I want you to add notes or drawing to your map. So I will give you 30 seconds from now to sketch this out. Alberta is abundant in natural resources. In order to learn about them, we need to learn about the land we get our resources from. So we can divide Alberta into 6 natural regions based on the climate, the geology, and the plants and animals that live there. As I go through each region, add it to your map. So you can add all the lines for each region to your map as well as we go through them. So our first region in the green is our boreal forest, and that's our largest region in Alberta. Next, we have the foothills in the blue, and we've got 2 sections of foothills in Alberta. Then we've got the Rocky Mountains in purple, Up in the top right corner, we've got the Canadian Shield in yellow. We've got the parkland in red. And lastly, we have the grassland. So I'll give you another maybe 20 or 30 seconds just to finish writing these down and drawing the lines on your map. Okay, so in Alberta, we have many natural resources. We've got wind, we've got trees, we've got water, we've got soil and crops, wildlife and sunlight, and these are our renewable resources, meaning we can either use them over and over again, or they will come back in our lifetime. And then on the other side, we have our coal, our natural gas, our oil, and our minerals. And these are our non-renewable resources. So once we use them, we can't use them again. And as you might expect, natural resources are not distributed equally throughout the natural regions. Certain parts of the province are abundant in one natural resource, while others may not have much of it at all. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the resources in each area a little bit later in the presentation. But where did it all come from? How did we end up in a province so abundant in natural resources with the resources distributed in this way? To learn about where all our natural resources come from, we're going to take a journey. And that journey starts at the top of a mountain like this one, Cascade Mountain, viewed from Rundle Mountain in Banff National Park. If you're a daring adventurer and you climb all the way to the top of the mountain, you might notice something in the rocks along the way. So these are a type of fossil, but more specifically, these are corals from a coral reef, rugose corals actually, which are around 500 million years old. And typically we find corals at the bottom of the ocean. So how did these corals get to the top of the mountain? To understand this, we need to go back in time. And I'm talking way back in time, around 250 to 500 million years ago, in a time known as the Paleozoic. So a long time ago, way before even the first dinosaurs, most of the land that is Alberta had not yet formed. The rocks of the Canadian Shield are some of the oldest rocks in Canada, and the minerals that we find there are almost as old as the Earth itself, which is about 4.543 billion years old. The rest of what will become Alberta was the bottom of the ocean, and that ocean was filled with strange and wonderful sea life, and the fossils from these sea creatures are the fossils we find at the top of our mountains today. So as we fast forward through time, the world begins to change. Many creatures have disappeared or gone extinct and have been replaced by new ones, including the very first dinosaurs. So now we're about 200 million years in the past. Some of the rocks, which used to be the ocean floor, are pushed up through the top of the water, becoming islands, which will eventually become our Rocky Mountains. The ocean that covered the rest of Alberta was full of life like algae, represented by those green splotches, and all sorts of animals, represented by the squids. The algae and the animals which died sank to the bottom of the ocean and were buried. And under the weight of all those rocks above and the heat of the earth, these living things became natural resources which are very important today. So they actually became oil and gas. So most oil is around 120 million years old, And natural gas can be as old as 380 million years. So that's pretty old. As we travel further forward in time, the dinosaurs begin to rule the world. So now we're at about 65 million years ago in a time known as the Late Cretaceous. The dinosaurs of Alberta lived in lush jungles and swamps on the shores of an ancient sea, which was slowly receding or flowing out of Alberta. And these jungles and swamps were full of life. The plants and animals that died during this time were buried, and just like before, the weight of rocks above them and the heat from the earth transformed them. The dinosaurs became fossils like the ones you might see at the Royal Tyrrell Museum in Drumheller, and the jungles and swamps from this time became another important natural resource we use today. And that resource is coal. So this is a very different picture, but this is actually still Alberta. Long after the dinosaurs were gone, the Earth went through something called a glacial period. Almost all of Alberta was under a thick sheet of ice with only a few mountain peaks in the Rocky Mountains sticking out from above. So those are the purple dots there that you see. So this has actually occurred 8 times in the last million years, with the most recent one being 100,000 years ago. The glaciers that formed during this time are an important source of water we use today. As the world begins to warm back up, the ice began to melt, creating space for the forests, the animals, and the soil we know today to grow. So now we're at about 15,000 years ago. Around this time, the first people in North America appear. Following resources like water, wildlife, and forests, the first indigenous people gathered in places where these resources were abundant. Mohkinstsis is one of the indigenous names for the place which we also call Calgary, a place where people have been gathering for thousands of years. And many towns and cities in Alberta are places where indigenous people gather. Mohkinstsis or Calgary is just one of those places. So the glaciers have now all melted almost all the way, leaving only small pockets of ice in the Rocky Mountains, and Alberta looks a lot like it does today. 300 years ago, Alberta was abundant in natural resources, just like it is today. And this is around the time where the first European colonists came to Alberta in search of resources. The Europeans learned how to use Alberta's resources to survive from the indigenous people who had already been doing it for thousands of years. They traded and worked together to gather resources which were sent back to Europe. Alberta's first major resource industry was actually something known as the fur trade, where we extracted resources from wildlife. And the fur trade played an important role in the establishment of many modern communities in Alberta, like Edmonton, where a fort was established for the fur trade. So that's Fort Edmonton. The fur trade and the rest of Alberta's abundance of resources brought more and more European settlers. The furs were in such high demand that many of the animals which were harvested for their fur became rare and difficult to find. And this would ultimately lead to the end of the fur trade. But even though the fur trade had ended, the European people remained and their numbers began to grow. And then, as technology advanced, the people of Alberta discovered an ancient resource underground that they could use for heat and electricity. This resource, coal, has historically been used the most to produce electricity in Alberta. And we've been using coal, which comes from the time of the dinosaurs, for almost 200 years. And coal mines were established wherever we could find coal. So this led to the establishment of communities like Lethbridge and Drumheller. And then, 80 years ago in northern Alberta, people began to pay attention to a thick black sand that could be found near the Athabasca River. Beechmont was the first oil sands operation near Fort McMurray. And since then, oil and gas have become Alberta's largest resource industry today. Before the discovery of oil, coal was a really booming industry in Alberta, but it has been on the decline ever since. So cities like Lethbridge have had to adapt to survive and have begun to harness wind, a renewable resource for energy. And now, wind is the fastest growing type of renewable electricity in Alberta. Lethbridge is also an important center for agriculture, which is our second largest resource industry, and that uses soil to grow crops. So here we are today. Now you know a little bit more about where Alberta's resources came from and how they were important in shaping Alberta as a province today. So now I want to take a closer look at each of our 6 natural regions and some of the things you might see that makes them unique. This will include some of the vegetation and wildlife of the area, as well as the various ways humans influence the region. We will also highlight some of the innovative ways Albertans are answering the call to respond to environmental challenges in these regions. So for this part of our presentation, you will need your map of Alberta that you've been filling out. As I go through each natural region, I want you to draw or write one animal or plant that you might see, one industry you might see, and either a challenge or an innovation of that area. So we are going to start with the boreal forest. Alberta's boreal forest is the largest natural region in the province, but it's just a small part of the boreal forest, which goes all the way across Canada and spans across other continents as well. This natural region is a vast forest, so you'll see a variety of different trees like white or black spruce, jack pine, or balsam and aspen poplar. This area is also home to huge flocks of migratory birds, so birds that fly south in the fall and fly north in the spring, like tree swallows, or this guy, the critically endangered whooping crane, as well as other wildlife like beavers, or maybe this guy here, the caribou. There are 2 main natural resource industries in the boreal forest. The first is forestry, which involves harvesting or chopping down trees to turn them into wood and paper products. Most forestry in Alberta actually happens in the boreal forest because there are so many trees and because these trees are mostly softwoods like pine, spruce, or fir, which are valuable for turning into wood products. The second resource industry is oil and gas. Alberta actually has 3 major oil sands regions, all of which are in our boreal forest. So it's not just about the resources that are above the soil, but the resources that we can find underground as well. When we consider starting a forestry or oil and gas operation, we also have to consider the wildlife that use the boreal forest for habitat and make sure we're leaving them the space and resources they need to survive. Caribou management plans, for example, are designed to help caribou habitat and populations recover. One of the challenges faced by oil sands development in the boreal forest are greenhouse gas emissions. Greenhouse gases, like carbon dioxide, are released when we combust fossil fuels, and that contributes to climate change. So what's being done to help with this? So something called carbon capture, utilization, and storage. It isn't a silver bullet, but it is a cool innovation that's helping to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in our energy sector. In Alberta, we have 2 active carbon capture projects, Quest, operated by Shell, and the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line. So how carbon capture works is it either captures carbon from the atmosphere and stores it deep underground in rocks, or it can capture carbon from the atmosphere and reuse it in operations to help increase the efficiency of those operations. So if you want on your map, you can add the letters CCUS for carbon capture, utilization, and storage to your map in the boreal forest for an innovation. Next, we have the foothills of Alberta, a region where the ground gets higher and higher as you get closer to the mountains. And similar to the boreal forest, it's covered in trees. Some of the species you might see here in the foothills are lodgepole pine, Alberta's provincial tree, white spruce, as well as balsam and aspen poplars. There's also many types of wildlife in the foothill, such as black bears, elk, moose, or my personal favorite of all of them, this guy, the lynx. The foothills natural region is where we do a lot of forestry, but it's also where we mine a lot of coal. So one of the things you might see in the foothills is this, a coal mine. The foothill natural region is a popular place for Albertans to go outside and have some fun, do things like hiking or camping or quadding or biking or fishing. These are all activities that are really popular in the foothills. So one of the challenges we face when extracting natural resources like coal from the foothills is taking into consideration the fact that the land is used by humans for all sorts of recreation, but also by wildlife for their habitat. So we have to keep that, or we have to take that into consideration. So what's up and coming in the foothills? Well, a lot, including something called geothermal energy. Geothermal, which literally means earth heat, involves using the heat from deep underground to generate electricity. Geothermal helps with land use because it can be built partially underground, therefore requiring less land when compared to other resources like coal. It's currently used in some houses in Alberta for heating, but isn't used yet for electricity. That is going to change, though, with the development of the Greenview Geothermal Power Plant near Grande Prairie. This geothermal power plant will be the first conventional geothermal energy facility in the province, and it's expected to be finished either next year in 2023 or in 2024, and will produce enough electricity to power 2,500 homes and enough heat to warm 30 acres of greenhouses. There is lots of geothermal potential across Alberta, and this is just one example of many companies working hard to harness that potential. So if you want a cool innovation for your map of Alberta, you can write down geothermal in the foothills. Okay, so now we're moving on to the Rocky Mountains. For the most part, the Rocky Mountains are protected by provincial and national parks, which means there isn't much natural resource extraction, so not much of oil and gas or mining or forestry. Some of the vegetation you might see in the Rocky Mountains are larches, which are one of my favorite trees, lodgepole pines or firs, and if you're lucky, you might even see an endangered species like this one, the white bark pine. In terms of wildlife, the Rocky Mountains are home to mountain goats, elks, and black bears, but also these guys, the big horned sheep, and that's just a couple examples of many types of wildlife that live in our Rocky Mountains. But one unique thing you might see in the Rocky are these, our glaciers. Glaciers are the headwaters of our freshwater in Alberta, and the water in your watershed actually comes from the Bow Glacier in Banff National Park, and that's the one we have pictured here. People travel from across Canada and the world to experience our mountains, and we get money in our economy from that tourism. But we also have to make sure that tourism doesn't become too impactful and affect resources like glaciers and the waterways they feed in the Rocky Mountains. One challenge in our waterways is dealing with something called aquatic invasive species. Aquatic invasive species, which are often unknowingly introduced by humans, like the zebra or quagga mussels pictured here on the right, or goldfish, can be very damaging to aquatic ecosystems. They outcompete the other species that live there by taking their resources away and upsetting the entire ecosystem. So there is a lot of public education going on to prevent the introduction of these species to our waterways. So some examples of these public education campaigns include Clean, Drain, Dry, which is a call to action to empower people who use our water bodies to help stop the spread of these harmful invasive species through changes in their behavior. It wants you to clean, drain, and dry all watercraft, trailer, motors, and gear every time, everywhere. Another educational campaign is something called Don't Let It Loose. So this is an educational campaign about avoiding the introduction of invasive species into our water bodies, which can often lead to, for example, goldfish in our waterways. It's about never releasing aquarium pets, water garden plants, live food, or live bait into the rivers, streams, lakes, ponds, or storm sewers. There are also, and maybe you've seen them on the side of the road, watercraft checkpoints. So this was something initiated by the government of Alberta, and these are watercraft inspection stations that are along our highways where it's mandatory that anybody transferring watercraft must have their boats, their trailers, and any water equipment checked by inspectors for invasive species to help stop the unknowing spread of that invasive species. So now we're going to move on to the Canadian Shield. So the Canadian Shield is just a small part of Alberta, and this place is quite different than the rest of the province. It's really, really rocky and wet with lots of different wetlands, but there's also even some sand dunes in the Canadian Shield. And in the Canadian Shield, we see a lot of coniferous forests with trees like jack pine or black spruce, but also some mixed wood forests as well, with species like birch and aspen. Some animals you might see up in the Canadian Shield include birds like this one, the sandhill crane or bald eagles, as well as mammals such as otters, minks, or this guy, the beaver. The majority of the Canadian Shield in Alberta is protected, so there isn't much in the area for resource extraction. However, uranium is a unique mineral that can be mined from the Canadian Shield natural region and is used for something known as nuclear energy. We don't actually have nuclear power here in Alberta, but there is the potential for something called small modular nuclear reactors to be introduced in Alberta in the next 5 to 10 years. So small modular reactors, or SMRs, are nuclear fission reactors. So it's a similar process to those used in a traditional nuclear power plant like the one I just showed you on the last slide. And these are being designed to be built a lot smaller, but in a larger number than most of the world's current nuclear fleet. SMRs are being designed to be small in both their power output and their physical size. They're designed to be modular, meaning they're factory constructed, and portable, like the one you see on the back of the truck in the photo. And they're going to be reactors, so they're going to use that nuclear fission reaction to produce energy. And that could be energy for things like electricity, heating, or water desalination. Some SMRs could be deployed in the near term, but most will probably be available in the next 7 to 15 years. So a little ways into the future yet. So if you want a cool innovation for your map in the Canadian Shield region, you can write SMR down on the map. Small modular reactors. Now we're going to move on to the parkland. So the parkland is a region of Alberta where the boreal forests or foothills transition into grasslands. So there's patches of forest, mostly made up of aspen or balsam poplar, mixed with shrubs and grass species like rough fescue or western porcupine grass. The animals that we see in this region will depend on which part of the parkland we're in, but they could include things like snowshoe hare, deer, or elk, to name a few. There are many resource industries within the parkland. As we move farther south in Alberta, we start seeing more fertile soils that lend themselves to agriculture, so farming and ranching. But the parkland also has mining and oil and gas. The parkland is the most populated region in Alberta and is home to our province's capital, Edmonton. Because the parkland has a lot of people, that means there's a lot of demand for natural resources. So lots of people need a lot of electricity, they need a lot of heat, and they need a lot of water, for example. Throughout Alberta's history, coal has been the main resource that's been used for electricity. A challenge with using coal for electricity is that when it's burned, a lot of greenhouse gases are released into the atmosphere. So in Alberta, we've actually committed to phasing out coal for electricity by 2030. So they don't want to use coal to make electricity at all by 2030, but they're probably going to succeed in doing this a lot sooner than that, within the next 1 to 2 years. But the demand for electricity isn't going down. There's still all these people who need it, so it has to be replaced with something. So what is it being replaced with? It's actually being replaced with a bunch of different things. We are diversifying the natural resources we use for energy and transitioning over to resources with less greenhouse gas emissions. Examples include, natural gas. So many of the thermal coal power plants in the parkland region of Alberta are being converted to natural gas operations. And natural gas produces about 50 to 60% less emissions than coal. So it is that much better for the environment. There is something else we're doing called biomass energy. So this is energy generated or produced by living or once living organisms. Most electricity generated from biomass is produced through direct combustion or burning, but can also be produced through something called anaerobic digestion, where a specific type of anaerobic bacteria breaks it down. Biomass energy is renewable as it uses trees that grow within a human lifetime, and it actually uses waste products that would otherwise be thrown away. Another resource we're going to be using is solar. So right now in Alberta, we get less than 1% of our electricity from solar, but we're hoping with the completion of something called the Travers Solar Project in Vulcan County that we'll be able to exceed that 1%. So this project, the Travers Solar Project, is going to be the largest solar farm in Canada, and that's going to be right here in Alberta, and it's going to produce enough electricity to power 150,000 homes. And there's also something known as wind energy, which is our fastest growing renewable type of energy. So right now we get 11 to 18% of our electricity from wind, depending on the day. Obviously, if it's more windy, it's going to be closer to 18%, and if it's less windy, it's going to be less than that. So those are just a few examples of how we're trying to change the types of energy we use for electricity. And then we have the grasslands. So the grasslands of Alberta are one of the sunniest places in Canada. There's wide open fields with farms as far as the eye can see here. The grasslands of Alberta are home to many species such as the mule deer, the swift fox, or the Great Plains toad, to name a few. The biggest resource in the grasslands region is agriculture, and that's the practice of growing plants or crops and the rearing of animals for food, human needs, or economic gain. Much of the native grassland habitat has been converted into these farms. One challenge in this area is that although it is warm and sunny, the soil is actually really, really dry, and that can make agriculture tricky. This is something that's becoming more and more challenging with climate change, as climate change is leading to more incidences of drought. So one way we can help deal with these dry soils is through our extensive irrigation system. Irrigation isn't new to Alberta, but we are currently in the process of undergoing an extensive modernization of our irrigation system. So the Alberta Irrigation Modernization is a $933 million project that will see big changes to our irrigation system in Alberta. So that could be things like replacing irrigation canals with pipelines, as you can see in the left there. It's going to be modernization of our canals and, for example, new irrigation reservoirs. So these modernization projects will save water, reduce evaporation and seepage, reduce spillage, and lead to a more reliable water distribution system for our farmers. And these are excellent adaptations to climate change because our water use is more efficient. Okay, so that was our last area. So now your map should look something like this. So hopefully you've been able to follow along. This has been a little bit of a whirlwind trip, but hopefully your map looks something like your map up here on the screen. So those were our 6 natural regions. There's a whole lot more than what we've talked about going on in each region. So I want you to keep learning, and if possible, try and take an actual road trip to see it for yourself. So I want to talk a little bit more now about who uses our natural resources. So let's look at the example of a forest. So trees. What are some of the users of this forest? So I want to give you guys 1 minute to take a look at the poster you see up on your screen. And on your maps of Alberta, I want you to write down 3 users of this forest. So I'll give you 1 minute from now. Okay, so that was 1 minute. So I'm hoping you were able to find at least 3 users of this forest. Some of the examples that we came up with were the skiers, the hikers, or the golfers. So Albertans who love to use the land for recreation. There's also wildlife throughout this poster. There's some bears and some elk and I think some deer. So we share the land with all the animals and other living things that make it their home. Maybe you noticed the mine up in the top right corner, so we can mine non-renewable resources from below the ground. There's the forester chopping down trees, as well as the lumber mill right in the middle, so we can harvest trees from the forest for building materials and other uses. There's the fishers or the hunters, so they can take food from the land in the form of wildlife. And of course, there's the water. So everything you see in this poster relies on the water for life. So you can probably agree with me when I say our forests are really, really busy places with many users on the land together. Because there are competing demands for natural resources, we have to make sure that we're considering all of those demands and balancing them. Natural resources are used for so many things, our basic needs, for energy, and to make all of the things we use in our lives. And that's a lot of demand on the land. Are there possible ways we could use our natural resources differently or maybe better? Definitely. As we know, our non-renewable resources do not last forever, and even renewable resources like forests or wildlife or soil can be in danger if we overuse them. Stewardship means taking care of something that we care about. Part of being a good steward of our natural resources is thinking about how we can improve the use of our resources. As we've learned today, Alberta's full of natural resources, many of which make energy. We might think that because we have a lot that we can afford to waste a little bit, but it's actually more important for us living here and now to set an example of stewardship so that natural resources can be used and enjoyed for many years to come. And there's a lot being done to improve the use of our resources. One example is how lumber companies use their scrap wood to make biomass energy. They burn the bark and they turn the waste sawdust into little power pellets to burn to make electricity. So what I want to know from you is, what can you do to conserve natural resources? Conserve means to make sure that the resources are still available for future use. So this is a discussion I want you to have after our presentation is done in your classes. And I want you to come up with as many ways that you can conserve natural resources, and I want you to write them down on your map of Alberta. So here are some of the daily examples that we came up with. So you can buy less or do your shopping at thrift stores, only buy what you need. You can reduce your water usage, so take shorter showers or turn off the tap while you're brushing your teeth. You can conserve electricity, so that means limiting TV or device time and turning out lights when you're not in a room. You can drive less if possible, so you could try biking or walking to school or maybe taking the bus or carpooling. You could grow a garden, so grow your own food or plant trees. You can reduce, reuse, recycle, or retrofit. And very importantly, you can learn more and share what you know with others. The more we know about things, the more we can care about them, and the more we're going to want to ensure that they're available for future generations. You could also start thinking about action projects at your school or in your community. So here are a couple examples of student action projects that we've seen. There's the new Merriman School, so students from grades 7 to 12 retrofitted a golf cart with solar PV modules to make it a renewable energy transport vehicle. There's the Hampton School in Calgary, who used bike generators and pedal generators to charge rechargeable batteries. There's Matthew Halton School, so students built energy efficiency kits and distributed them to elementary students with a presentation and community info night. So we've seen a whole bunch of different things, and it can be starting small like a litter cleanup, but there's a whole bunch of bigger actions you can do as well. So that is it for my presentation. If you want to share your map and your stewardship ideas with us, you can upload them to social media and tag us at Inside Education. We would love to see what you've come up with. So yeah, thank you. And I hope you guys have a great rest of your morning.